What ensued left the whole crowd in utter shock. It was one of those afternoons in downtown Cincinnati where the sky promised rain but never quite delivered. The atmosphere was heavy with the smell of wet pavement and the greasy smell of fast food, a mixture of the city's frenetic energy and quiet decline. Walkers went about their normal pace, some with purpose, some abstracted. And then there was JD Vance, suspended somewhere in the middle. Vance walked in a steady pace, hands buried in his jacket pockets. He was dressed simply, and he didn't attract much attention, just another figure who just fit into the city. But even without the suit, someone saw him. A few turned their heads and whispered, throwing a swift look, some from the TV news, others from the news pages. His name was well known, but for this instant, he was one more guy pushing through a street of old-fashioned storefronts, dodging every now and again an abandoned scooter. And then suddenly, out of the city hum, a voice sliced through, "Spare a dollar, man." It wasn't the first time Vance had been asked that question. He had spent long enough in environments like this to recognize the familiar cadence of street solicitations. A nod or a polite headshake was usually all it took to continue on. But something about this moment, perhaps the uncertainty in the man's tone or the fact that he wouldn't meet his eyes, caused Vance to lag behind. The man was gaunt, but not so much in the manner that hunger saps a person. His face was sunken, his eyes looking bigger than they were. His attire, a haphazard assortment of layers, wasn't selected for appearance, but for staying alive. His face was circumscribed by a patchy, more haphazardly attended to than intentional beard, and his hands were hard and cracked from living too many cold nights outside. But what really grabbed your attention? He wasn't begging. He wasn't pressing. He was just standing there, waiting, as if he had asked himself this same question 1,000 times before and already braced for disappointment. Vance halted. Something within him made him ask, "Where is your name?" For an instant, the man was surprised. That wasn't how this was going to work. People normally either gave him a bill or left. He paused and then coughed. "Eddie," he grunted. Vance examined him, considering something in his head. Around them, the city continued in motion. People passed by, oblivious, ignorant. To them, it was merely another quick exchange between a politician and someone they had conditioned themselves to tune out. But for whatever reason, Vance couldn't let it go. Perhaps it was the way Eddie's shoulders were slumped, not in defeat, but in sheer exhaustion. Perhaps it was the quiet respect in the way he had inquired, not demanding, not acting, just present. And that's when everything shifted. Just asking, "You live around here?" Eddie looked up, his face inscrutable. Vance had posed the question nonchalantly, but the import behind it was far from. Eddie let out a little laugh, a laugh that was not quite, a laugh that was more like the absence of a laugh than the actuality thereof. "I live wherever I am able," he said. "You understand?" Vance nodded, but he didn't for his wallet. Not yet. Rather, he said, "How long have you been living on the street?" For an instant, Eddie hesitated. His eyes flicked towards the street, as if he was weighing whether to respond or simply turn and leave. "Too long," he finally grumbled. Vance breathed out, his breath misting in the chilly air. He could sense the presence of eyes on him now. Someone had halted nearby. Were they listening? Taping? He didn't know. It didn't matter. However, what he said after that did. Eddie shifted his position, pushing his hands into the deep pockets of his oversized coat. The material was stiff and frayed, its original color now somewhere between brown and gray. His fingers curled inside it, gripping at nothing, perhaps out of habit, perhaps simply because it was cold. Vance looked at him for a moment longer. Most politicians would have been long gone by this point. At best, they would have thrown a couple of dollars Eddie's way and left, hardly giving him a second glance. But Vance still didn't open his wallet, and Eddie caught on. His expression wavered, only for an instant, between anticipation and disappointment, as if he already knew how things would go. "I just need $1, Eddie said again. This time, his voice was less firm, as if reducing the cost of his demand would alter the response. Vance didn't respond immediately. Instead, he allowed his gaze to wander down the street. Undefined, a small group had begun to congregate, quiet but observing. A man stooped against a lamppost, as though checking his phone. Undefined, a woman walking groceries with slowed her pace. Undefined. A few steps away, a youth lingered, hands crammed in his hoodie pocket, eyes darting between Eddie and Vance. The city had the tendency to turn personal moments public spectacle. Vance spun back around to Eddie. "What would you do with it?" Eddie released a snort-hot mix. "Ain't that the question?" But Vance wasn't laughing. He was serious. Eddie's face clenched a notch tighter. "$1 don't get you much these days," he grumbled. "Perhaps a coffee, perhaps a slice of bread, if you know where to find it." There was a pause, then softer, almost too softly. "Or perhaps just a second where I don't feel like nothing." The words weighed on the air between them. They weren't desperate. They weren't defensive. They were simply honest. Vance's jaw clenched. He looked at Eddie's hands, still deep in his jacket pockets, fingers moving, as though holding on to something that wasn't there. "You used to work?" Vance asked. Eddie had another laugh, this one bitter, with an edge of something sharp. "Yeah," he said, "before life got in the way." Vance nodded slightly. "What was the job?" Eddie paused, then shrugged. "Plumber, not the fancy sort. Residential work primarily. Fixed broken pipes, replaced broken water heaters." He shook his head. "Ain't much call for a man who don't have a fixed address, though." Vance didn't say anything. He'd heard tales like this before. Some folks fell between the cracks so quickly, they hardly had time to get out of the way. Eddie stroked his chin, his fingers against the rough stubble. "So, you gonna pay me $1 or what?" Another break. Vance's response wasn't what anyone was expecting. "I'll give you something better." Eddie's forehead furrowed. "Man, I ain't asking for a sermon." "It's not a sermon," Vance replied matter-of-factly. Eddie looked at him warily. Around them, the street sounds seemed to quiet, just a little, as if the city itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. But whatever Vance had planned, it wasn't going to be easy. Eddie narrowed his eyes, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He'd been here before. Conversations that began like this tended to end with a lecture about bootstraps, personal responsibility, or making better choices. He steeled himself for the same. But Vance didn't deliver a speech. Instead, he simply asked, "When's the last time someone gave you a real shot?" Eddie scowled. "What? Like work? Like anything?" The inquiry surprised Eddie. He blinked, then glanced beyond Vance, as if seeking the answer in the cityscape beyond him. A slow breath escaped his lips after an eternity. "Been a while." Vance nodded, as if he'd already heard it. "You ever attempt to get off the streets?" Eddie glared. "Man, what are you asking me that for?" Vance didn't bat an eye. Eddie mocked, running his hand over the side of his face. "You think I want to be out here? You think this is some kind of option?" Vance remained silent, allowing him to rant. "I've tried shelters," Eddie went on. "Half of them full up before I even make it in the door. Tried working. You know what they tell me?" He imitated a tone, bitter and mocking. "Come back when you got a phone. Come back when you got an address." He let out a dry laugh. "Like I could pull that out of thin air?" Vance folded his arms, listening. Eddie shook his head. "You ever been homeless?" "No." Eddie smiled. "Yeah, didn't think so." Vance tilted his head slightly. "But I've been poor." That made Eddie look at him differently. still skeptical, but maybe a little less dismissive. Yeah? Vance nodded. Grew up in a house where sometimes the heat didn't work, where the fridge was mostly empty. Vance's voice was steady, his eyes unblinking. I know what it's like to go to school wearing the same clothes 2, 3 days in a row. Eddie sniffed, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. Yeah, well, bet you had a way out. Vance stood his ground. Too long. A pause of silence hung between them. Around them the crowd had swelled. People lingered, watching. A man with a baseball cap held up his phone, faking checking messages, but he was definitely recording. A woman spoke softly to her friend, her eyes darting between Vance and Eddie. Eddie let out a sharp breath. So what? You're gonna sit here and tell me to pull myself up? That I just need to work harder? Vance shook his head. No. Eddie narrowed his eyes. Then what? Vance reached into his jacket pocket and pulled something out. It wasn't money. It was a small, folded piece of paper. He held it out. Eddie eyed it suspiciously. What's that? A name? A number? Eddie didn't take it. What for? Someone who can help. Eddie gave him a look. Help? How? They have a program, Housing First. No strings. Eddie sneered. Undefined. Sure thing. Ain't that simple? Vance didn't drop his hand. Undefined? No, it isn't. But it exists. Eddie paused. He had been offered empty promises before, undefined posters for shelters that were full to capacity, figures for programs with waiting lists months long. He wasn't certain if this was different at all, but something in Vance's expression, the fact that he wasn't smiling, wasn't attempting to sell him anything, made Eddie hesitate. Why are you doing this? Eddie asked. Vance's response was straightforward. Because someone once did it for me. Eddie swallowed, undefined. His gaze flicked between Vance and the paper in his hand. But he wasn't alone, and not everybody was on board with what was going on. Eddie glared at the crumpled paper as if it were a loaded question. He had been handed handouts before, undefined soup kitchen flyers, dog-eared business cards from social workers who never returned their calls, torn-up church pamphlets promising prayers rather than answers. But something in this moment was different. Eddie finally extended his hand and took the paper, but not before giving it a dubious look. His rough, unsteady fingers from the cold unfolded it. The name on the inside meant nothing to him. The number didn't either. It might be real. Or another dead end. He breathed hard through his nose. That's it? He glared at Vance. No buck? A couple of people in the crowd snickered. Someone cursed under their breath. The guy with the baseball cap fidgeted with his phone, still filming. Vance remained unfazed. Would a buck do any good? Eddie snorted. Wouldn't hurt. Vance kept his eyes locked on him. Wouldn't matter either. Eddie gritted his teeth. Man, I ain't asking you to save me. I just asked for a damn dollar. Another scoff came from the crowd. A woman off to the side shook her head, muttering, Just give him the money, man. Vance ignored the voices. His focus was on Eddie. You said you worked before. Plumbing, right? Eddie exhaled hard. Yeah, what about it? Vance took out his phone. There is a fellow I know. Has a contracting business in Dayton. He's always hiring. He'll give someone who needs a second chance a shot. Eddie eyed him warily. You for real? Vance nodded. I call him. You go. You work. You're paid. No crap. The group moved. A kid in a hoodie leaned over and whispered something to his buddy. A man along the sidewalk, who had been observing in silence, shook his head and grumbled. Politicians, man. Always a stunt. Eddie laughed hard and dry. So let me get this straight. I ask for $1 and you're trying to give me a job? Vance's face didn't change. I'm trying to give you a way out. Eddie stood there for a hard moment, staring at him. His hold on the piece of paper tightened. He could sense the burden of every eye upon him, waiting to witness what he would do. Would he accept the offer or tell Vance to hell? Someone in the crowd finally lost it. This some kind of joke. The words were spoken by a man in his mid-40s, standing at the curb with a canvas grocery bag draped over his arm. His face was creased with skepticism, his mouth twisted in disbelief. "He didn't ask for a job interview," the man went on. "He asked for a damn dollar, a cup of coffee. You really think a dude who lives on the street can just roll up to a job like that?" Some of the others nodded in agreement, but Vance did not glance away from Eddie. "You tell me." Eddie's mouth was dry. His fingers ticked at his sides. He had been trapped in this existence for so long, he wasn't certain he even remembered how to want anything more. The sheet of paper in his hand was weighing him down like it was searing a hole in his flesh. And then, he did something nobody anticipated. Eddie's fingers wrapped around the paper as if cradling something delicate, something that didn't belong to him. His breathing weighed like a rock in his chest. A job, an actual shot, not a dollar, not a sympathetic pat on the back, something more. And yet, the burden of all the eyes upon him made his skin crawl. He could sense the judgment rolling off the folks standing around him, the ones who weren't homeless, the ones who had homes to return to, warm beds, lives that didn't include begging for loose change. "You gonna take it or what?" The man with the grocery bag dared, his tone sharp, halfway between disbelief and annoyance. Eddie gave him a glare. "What's it to you?" The man snorted, adjusting the weight of his pack. "What's it to me? I've seen guys like you 100 times. Always an excuse, always a reason why something ain't good enough." Eddie's jaw set. "Man, you don't know a damn thing about me." The man laughed hard. "I know you ain't worked in years. I know you're out here begging instead of trying. And I know you ain't about to take that offer." He shook his head. "And if you do, you'll quit the second it gets hard." The words cut deeper than Eddie wanted to admit. His hand clutched the paper harder. He wanted to tell the guy to shove off, to inform him he didn't have a clue what he was saying. But the reality was, some small part of Eddie did wonder, did he still possess it in him? Could he get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, struggle through tiredness, make it to the office, and get the job done? And then there was the flip side of that, the voice that whispered, "What if this is just another lie?" He spun back to Vance, his eyes full of something unreadable. "And what if this is crap? What if I go and they don't have nothing for me?" Vance did not blink. "Then you call me." Eddie scrunched up his eyes. "Call you?" Vance nodded, waving his phone in the air. "I don't give out my number to just anyone. But if you go and they don't offer you work, you call me, and I'll get you something else." A murmur ran through the small group. The kid in the hoodie leaned over to his friend. "Yo, is this for real?" The guy with the grocery bag snorted but said nothing further. Eddie could feel his heart racing in his chest. It was too much, too real. He'd spent so long waiting for people to shun him, to shun his eyes, to pretend he didn't exist. But now, this, a job, a lifeline. It terrified the hell out of him. He swallowed hard. "I don't even got a phone." Vance didn't flinch. He dug into his coat pocket and produced a tiny black burner phone, held it out. "Now you do." The crowd fell dead silent. There were a few gasps. One person whispered, "No way." Eddie looked at the phone as if it were something outside of himself, his breathing not quite steady. No one had ever done something like this for him. He could feel the pressure of the moment weighing against him. And then, when things seemed to be more charged than they could possibly be, a voice sliced through the tension like a knife. "This is all for show." Eddie's hand on the phone clamped harder. His heart, thudding with something almost hope, grasped at the charge. The older man who'd made the statement had a salt and pepper beard and a worn flannel shirt with around a mid-50s age. He stared at Vance, arms crossed, expression unyielding. Is this some political publicity stunt? He spoke in a tone laced with doubt. Cameras rolling, eyes on us, and you're out here rescuing a homeless guy? What happens when they turn the cameras off? Rumblings went through the crowd. Some nodded, some were unsure. Vance didn't blink as he held the man's gaze. You think I did that for attention? The man sneered. Ain't that what politicians do? Eddie looked between them, his stomach twisting in a knot. He refused to accept that's what this was. Refused to accept he was simply another pawn in someone else's tale. But that doubt, so well entrenched, so long honed, resurfaced. Vance never raised his voice, never used flashy language to defend himself. He merely spoke. What I did today isn't changed just because there are people looking on. If you think it is, that speaks more to the world you've experienced than to me. The guy in the flannel didn't reply immediately. He just shook his head, muttering to himself and walking away. A female onlooker was next to talk. So, what next then? Eddie blinked in surprise as it became apparent she was talking to him. It shook around inside his chest. He had the phone, he had the number, he had the opportunity. But was he actually going to do it? He licked his lips, looking down at the burner phone again before shoving it into his pocket. Guess I make a call, he said to himself. It was the least commitment he could make. Just a call, just a first step. Vance nodded. That's all you gotta do. Eddie shifted his weight. And if I screw it up? Vance's response was immediate. You try again? Eddie released a slow breath. He didn't know if this would alter his life. Didn't know if this was another false promise or the real deal. But for the first time in a long time, he had something. A name, a number, a phone. And perhaps, just perhaps, a second chance. Vance backed away, allowing him room. No pressure, no drama, just a plain truth left suspended in the air. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone camera snapped. A couple of individuals walked away, still arguing with one another about whether what they just saw really happened. But for Eddie, they didn't have a say. This wasn't for them. This was about if he was ready to fight for himself anymore. He breathed in deeply, squared his shoulders, and walked away. This time with something in his pocket that was more than just another broken promise. Not all chances present themselves in the way we hope. Some never present themselves at all. But when they do, when somebody calls out and says, I see you, the most difficult step isn't accepting the assistance. It's believing you're worthy of it. Perhaps Eddie places that call. Perhaps he doesn't. But the moral here isn't about an assured result. It's about what we get when we quit presuming people are too far gone and begin treating them like they're still human. If this tale made you ponder, pass it on. You never know who may need to hear it today. And if you've ever had a second chance, drop a comment below, because sometimes it's all that hope a person has to know someone else made it through. Ensure that you're subscribed for more provocative stories that put the world we know into perspective.